Good evening. Well, first, I want to say thank you for welcoming me here tonight. This is not only my first time with you, but also my first time in an MCC congregation. You've all been very welcoming to me. Food in and of itself was a good welcome, and as well as being welcoming to my spouse. And we're so grateful to be able to share an evening with you. I need to thank Jim for inviting me. I'm not sure what it says about the level of trust you've placed in him, though, is that he invited me, a stranger, to preach here after having spoken to me for less than 5 minutes. However, I have a feeling it says a great deal more about my trepidation and his wisdom and less about my abilities and his lack of caution. We met at Boston Pride earlier this year, which, as has been true of so many things in my life recently, was also a first for me. Not only in this new city that I call home, but my first Pride ever. It was a beautiful experience. I'll tell you more about how I ended up marching in Pride, but it would be more meaningful to first tell you where I've been. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, home of country music. Tennessee is a beautiful, if overlooked, place. Nashville is growing like a weed recently, though, and oftentimes when I see pictures people post on social media of their favorite place in the city, it is something completely unrecognizable or unknown to me. And in many ways, that is truer on a much grander scale of the South. For better or for worse, it is a place that I recognize less and less. And I say that with the awareness that I've only been out of the South now for not quite 1 year. I lived in Nashville for 18 years, then alternated between there and the Deep South in Birmingham, Alabama, for 4 years of undergrad. I then transitioned to Durham, North Carolina, which I thought was edging me closer out of the South's grasp, but as many of you know, Durham is thoroughly and in many ways regrettably Southern. I spent 1 more year after divinity school in Birmingham, where my spouse and I lived for 1 year in a tiny but charming, for all of its dilapidation, apartment with 2 window AC units, which may cut it here, but there they seemed like a cruel joke. I find it nothing short of ironic that in the Bible Belt, threats of fire and brimstone are heaped on churchgoers as though they did not just walk across what felt like an active tar pit on the surface of the sun just to reach the sanctuary doors. Escaping the heat is an entire branded industry in the South. Whether you're being sold the waters of baptism or the cool refreshment of a summertime swim, there are no few stories, in fact, written by the South's finest authors, Graham Greene, Faulkner, Harper Lee, Robert Penn Warren, Flannery O'Connor, that revolve around the theme of escape. In my wife's favorite novel, All of the King's Men, Robert Penn Warren ends the book by having his protagonist consider what it will be like to return home to the South one day. He says, "But that will be a long time from now. And soon now we shall go out of the house and go into the convulsion of the world, out of history into history, and into the awful responsibility of time." I try at every turn to avoid any sort of essentialism, especially ones that can be expressed aphoristically. But there is something hauntingly true about the South expressed in Warren's words. This sense of awful responsibility that burdens you when you go out into the world. It seems to me that in as many ways as the South creates and recreates the conditions of oppression, poverty, racism, and bigotry, it also imbues in its children an indelible sense of eternal return. You cannot escape it, not really. You might flee from it contextually, geographically, intellectually, and spiritually, but like any other good specter, the South haunts indiscriminate of your current affective, physical, or psychic state of well-being. Nevertheless, we try to escape it. We come to the Great White North, as all Southerners think of New England, with a realistic but paradoxically romanticized hope that this place holds all the answers to the questions we've been asking. But before physical removal becomes an option, before you're old enough to set out on your own and go out of history into history, you're stuck finding other ways of escape, to imagine life otherwise than it is. I really had no reason to do this. Favored son of the South that I am, literally white, cisgender, heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon, literally Anglo-Saxon, blonde hair, blue eyes to boot, Protestant evangelical. There was nothing, not one thing, in the South, or for that matter, in the world arranged to my disadvantage. And yet, my favorite literary phrase, and yet, I found the need to escape. I found the means to do so through music. Nashville is the home of country music and is known more generally as Music City, USA, so it's obligatory to know how, on some fundamental level, to play an instrument or to sing in general, but I never excelled at any of that. In fact, I never felt any great affinity for country music except for Johnny Cash, but that's a story for a different time. I do remember, however, the very first time I was transported to a different world and escaped the South. I was carrying around my new Sony CD player with skip protection, top of the line. I walked down the stairs into our bonus room and saw that my oldest sister had left some CDs at the top of the stairs leading down to her apartment below our house. I rifled through them to get a sense of her taste. I wanted so much to be like her. Until I happened on one jewel case. You remember jewel cases? The cover art was a deep, mysterious blue, and there was a crest on the front. I opened it and found the disc, popped it into my CD player, and pressed play. I then heard those magical words for the first time. Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Caught in a landslide. No escape from reality. I was mesmerized. I lied at the bottom of those stairs on my stomach and listened to Bohemian Rhapsody on repeat for about an hour. I had no idea what the words meant, but I knew they were for me. I quickly became obsessed with Queen, something that hasn't ended. I found out everything I could about them, jealously hoarding the family desktop to read articles, find pictures to print off for the Queen scrapbook and the 2 Queen posters I was making that are still somewhere, and to read about Freddie Mercury, the man behind the voice that enchanted me into a new place. I learned quickly about his short but immensely successful life, where he was born, Zanzibar, where he went to boarding school in India, his parents and his sisters' name, Jer, Bomi, and Kashmira. I listened to every song that he wrote or sang with increasing attention and intensity. My parents bought me the Queen Platinum Collection, the trilogy of all the greatest hits albums. I was in love. This was all tempered, however, by a constant, stern reminder from my parents and people in our religious community, though. Freddie Mercury had been bisexual and died the year I was born of complications from AIDS, the theology of which, being beyond irresponsible and hateful, I do not care to repeat, nor do I think I need to in this place. His life, they reminded me, was ultimately wasted and therefore very sad. They told me if I listened closely, I could hear him searching for something more, something better, something different. I was told especially to listen to works like Somebody to Love and Save Me, the song after which the sermon is named. The refrain of that song is particularly compelling. Save me, save me, save me. I can't face this life alone. Save me, save me, save me. I'm naked and I'm far from home. The song was written in 1979 by their guitarist, Brian May, for a friend of his going through a bad divorce. However, when I heard Freddie sing it, I heard him in it. I knew, thanks to Wikipedia, which is becoming more and more reputable by the time I was coming up, that he had come out to his lifetime partner, Mary Austin, just 3 years previously, in 1976, which effectively ended their relationship. The song Love of My Life, written in 1977, is most candidly about her, and yet there was something in Save Me that struck me. People would say, he wants someone to save him, but he just doesn't know where to look, Christian friends would tell me. He's searching in all the wrong places to find fulfillment. He sounds so sad. You can hear it in his voice in every song, someone else would say. I didn't believe them. I didn't care what they said about him or what they thought. While at the time I held my conservative, evangelical, theological beliefs very sincerely, Freddie was special to me in a way that I did not really care to share with anyone else. He was the exception in my life to the rules I thought needed to apply to everything and everyone. Everyone wanted to save Freddie, to rescue him from something, himself maybe. But the more everyone went on about what a waste his life had been, how sad he was, how morally reprehensible his lifestyle and subsequent death, the more I wanted to escape with him, to go wherever it was that he fled to in his music. He called to me in a voice I felt like only I could hear. There was something else behind it, though, a part of life that escaped me. There was something in Freddie's voice, in his words, his singing, that I had never known before. And I knew what I wanted then. I wanted to know. I wanted to escape and find what it was that made him sing, and what made so many people assume it was him who needed saving. I want to break free. I want to break free. I want to break free from your lies. You're so self-satisfied. I don't need you. What I realized was that I wanted desperately for someone to save me. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how many hours I spent at church and youth group, preaching from the age of 15, worshiping, going to conferences, singing in the choir, or how often I rededicated my life to Jesus, whatever that means, I never felt as though I belonged where I was. I felt out of place, which somehow I couldn't believe to be true. I was raised in a loving, stable, encouraging, and faithful family. My parents worked tirelessly to provide for my sisters and me. We were never pressured to be or to do anything other than who we were. We were simply loved and guided and cared for. And that is still true. My parents and siblings, all of us, still love one another unconditionally. And now that my sisters have children of their own, our family is getting to pass on our traditions. Scathing wit, game nights, a love of movies, sports, education, medicine, and faith. In this way, I consider myself incomparably blessed, really actually blessed, to be able to call that my family. And yet, despite all that, not in spite, but despite, I nonetheless felt lost. I heard something in Freddie that I knew I was not hearing from the other parts of my life. And it wasn't a cry for help, but it was a cry for the other. Pressure pushing down on me, pressure pushing down on you. Under pressure that brings a building down, splits a family in two, puts people on streets. It's the terror of knowing what the world is about, watching some good friends scream, "Let me out." All of the ways I've been taught to love the sinner and hate the sin, to disapprove, disregard, and despise the life worlds and lives, but somehow not the spirits, the bodies and faces of those around me, had effectively masked the cries of the vulnerable, the poor, the lonely, the suffering. No matter how hard you try to love the sinner and hate the sin, I found you always end up hating the sinner, hating the sin more than you love the sinner. Until the two blur together and the sinner becomes the disapproved, the disregarded, the despised. I wanted so desperately for someone to save me from that way of being. And as it turns out, it was I who was looking for answers in all the wrong places. Usually in dating relationships where I often sought the joy of a companionship that did not remind me of all the things that did not make sense to me. but also in an increasingly dark, scathing sense of humor behind which I could hide what became a lifelong journey with depression. When I was young, it was a hiding from a feeling like, although the world around me was organized in a way to accommodate someone just like me, I didn't belong to that world. When I became a teenager and young adult, through college and in divinity school, it sharpened into feelings of intellectual and spiritual abandonment and bewilderment, especially when I realized I no longer belonged culturally, politically, socially, or theologically to my home of origin. At a few points in my life, I would anesthetize the feelings of loss and confusion by taking prescription pain pills so meticulously as to be able not have to feel at all if I didn't want to. I was ready to drown in all the things I did not know, understand, or could not reconcile with who I was becoming. And that's why our gospel lesson tonight means so much to me. The passage that immediately precedes the one that Emily read finds Jesus walking on the water. In verses 16 and following of chapter 6 in John, the gospel writer says, "When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, 'It is I. Don't be afraid.' Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were rowing." This passage means so much to me because it frustrates me as much as it likely frightened and stupefied the disciples that Jesus walked on the water. Who does that? Who just steps out with all the confidence in the world after almost being seized upon by a great crowd of people who have been following you for days, and with all the confidence in the world just treads on the unknown? The disciples, John tells us, are immediately concerned for Jesus' well-being, and right well they should be. Matthew, Mark, and John all tell us some version of the wind was against them and the sea was getting rough. What John leaves out in our reading today, at least that's part of Matthew and Mark, is that Jesus apparently meant to, quote, pass them by as he set out across the rough sea. Nevertheless, his response to them was the same in each gospel. "It's me. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." Right. Don't worry about it, because being in the middle of open water, having rowed some 3 or 4 miles with the wind beating against you the whole way in unsteady boats, and not knowing where your friend is, and then seeing him walk towards you on the water, walking on the water, that's not cause for alarm. If anyone ever needed saving, I'm sure the disciples thought it was Jesus. Who knows what was going through their minds? After he performed the miracle of the fishes and the loaves, the crowd had tried to seize him. In other gospel version, Jesus puts the disciples into the boat and sets them off. But in John, the disciples flee to the boat and across the sea after Jesus fled back into the hills. We have no reason, drawing from John's rendering at least, to think that the disciples knew when they might see Jesus again after that. But I doubt they thought they'd find him strolling across the Sea of Galilee as they huffed it across in these boats. Struggling, doing all of the right things, to be sure, as many of them were fishermen before they decided to follow this itinerant radical around all of Palestine and the slow, holy work of dismantling an empire in expectation of God's imminent presence in the world, or so Jesus claimed. So here they are, prepared, experienced, in a boat, likely demonstrating great skill given the conditions. They have done everything right, and it's not working. And here comes Jesus, walking on the water, doing everything wrong, according to seafaring, human nature, physics, the little things. But as I know you know, this is what Jesus did. Jesus disrupted and disputed. Jesus frustrated and refuted. Jesus confused and confirmed everything we've always known to be true about God. God walks on the water. God treads where we do not let our feet fall. God is willing to do what is unacceptable, what is unexpected, what is unthinkable, and what is unbelievable. In the incarnation, God in the flesh, Jesus disrupts and disputes. He frustrates and refutes. He confuses and confirms our notions, our norms, our dogma, our doctrine. In Jesus, God confronts our sensibilities, and most importantly, at least for me, our sense of what is safe, what is right, and what is acceptable. Jesus walking on the water queers our sense of who it is that needs saving. Surely it is this man looking for all the answers in the wrong places. The man who thinks he can walk across a stormy sea and meet his friends along the way. Here's Jesus, a precocious child with a singularly gifted mind. He is outspoken to the powers that be, but reserved with his friends. He is concerned for the unloved, the unfed, the unclothed, the unwanted, and preaches of a different life that is not only to come, but a life that is to be realized here and now. Surely it is Jesus who needed saving. The first son of an unwed mother. He has amazing gifts, but he squanders them all. A Palestinian Jewish man of classical antiquity, seemingly not interested in having a family, though he is scandalously interested in eating with, touching, being touched by, and healing the untouchable. He does not deny intimacy to those whom society denies it to. He mocks the government and is in open disdain and rebellion of the powers that be, insofar as they represent the power to drive any undesirable others into non-being. The powers that split the family into, or dictates what and who constitutes a family, and as we strip children from their parents, detain them in holding cells, drug them, and sexually assault them. Puts people on streets, and refusing housing as a fundamental right, constructs ghettos, internment camps, federal reservations, and massive for-profit prisons in an effort to then clean up the streets. Watching some good friends screaming, "Let me out." Knowing people are trapped by circumstance, by structural oppression in the form of racism, heterosexism, and ableism, by the vicissitudes of poverty, illness, and stigmatized mental health diagnoses, whose screams are drowned out by the din of our empire's march toward a horizon of death under the aegis of a neoliberal, capitalistic deformation of lives. Of our lives, of our ecologies, our life worlds, into commodities that are cruelly governed by the impulse to own and to compete and to accumulate. Who's looking for more, really? But surely it was Jesus who needed saving, just like Freddie. Surely it is easier to hate the sin and not the sinner, easier to figure out what it is that's wrong with them and not hear them crying out for justice in a broken world. It is easier to think that the man walking on the water, or the gay man who made camp and joy and neighbor love a part of rock and roll mainstream, are most at risk, are most needful of saving. But I think both Jesus and Freddie were saying the same thing. Do not be afraid. It's me. This is me. This is who I am. I am not afraid of whatever it is that means, though I can tell you are. Everyone I knew growing up was so concerned about who needed saving, about hearing the pain in their voice, about finding what it is that was sinful or what it is that is risky or dangerous, and what is so other about the other that makes them so needful of their saving. But I found in Freddie and in Jesus quite the opposite lesson. I learned that it was I that needed saving, from where I was, where I'd been, and where I was going. In them both, I started to learn what it means to not be afraid to be me. And despite my evangelical upbringing, I learned that it was not a once and for all said and done act. It was a journey. It is as difficult, if not more difficult, than learning to walk on the water. To tread where impossibility looms large. To step out of the boat, out of reason, out of tradition, out of doctrine and dogma, and embrace the cool lapping of the waves at your feet, begging you to get wet. So when I took my first steps in the Pride Parade, I suppose I was learning again, imperfectly, how to walk on the water. How to say no, all over again, to those people who would have me believe that there is something intrinsically wrong that desperately needs saving in others. I was learning to walk where I'd never walked before, to accept a little more who I am in light of who I was, and looking forward to who I might become. And all because I take from Jesus walking on the water, as the wind beat against the boats, the courage not to fear, to be me. Because one day I walked down the stairs with my Sony CD player and let those words wash over me and become me. Easy come, easy go. Any way the wind blows. Doesn't really matter to me.